Essentially, I guess my idea about dreaming is that dreaming is extraordinary, and for me it represents a light in the darkness, and even in its most basic form, if you think about what dreaming is, it's being able to see extraordinary, colourful, light-filled worlds when we're asleep and we're in darkness. And to me that's the most extraordinary and yet simple fact of dreaming. So I've always been a lucid dreamer as long as I can remember. As a small child I loved my dreams, and so I was really into books like Alice in Wonderland, and as I grew older I got really into any films that felt remotely dreamlike, like David Lynch. I love Jodorowsky. I was talking to someone today about how Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain to me is like a dream work. He talks about this idea of psychomagic, of this idea that art can affect your consciousness and act as therapy. And if you watch Holy Mountain before you go to sleep, you'll find that you go on your own personal archetypal journey through the major arcana. So I would thoroughly recommend that as an activity for anyone who's interested in dreaming. So I've always been interested in dreaming, and when I was little, actually, I remember going to the library to try and find out more about dreaming, and I thought that I would start with neuroscience, because I thought people would be curious about dreaming if they were studying the brain. And then as I came to discover, I don't think neuroscientists are renowned for being great dreamers, because considering it's the most fantastic thing that we can produce in our minds, not many neuroscientists seem to study it. So I kind of became a bit disheartened by that and looked more into ancient cultures and how ancient cultures perceived dreaming. And I live in Hastings, and when I first moved there from London, I started my own little lecture club because I felt a bit sort of dissatisfied with what was available in St Leonard's and Hastings. Sort of culturally, I really wanted to learn things. And I invited a lot of different speakers to come and talk at my lecture club, and one of them was Dr. David Luke, who's at the University of Greenwich, and actually he was the one who told me about the sleep temple at Gloucester, and he said he'd just come back from visiting this British Romano sleep temple site in Gloucestershire, and it was this kind of penny dropping moment for me, because I've always been fascinated by dreaming. I've always loved ancient culture, and this idea that ancient culture and dreaming can fit together somehow was incredible for me. So I've been researching ancient dream culture since then, which was about 2012, I think, and then I was offered by Inner Traditions, because I've been co-hosting Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour with him for a while. I was offered by one of the editors there, Richard Grosinger, to write a book on the subject. So I'm still learning myself. I mean, every time I go on a trip to Greece, every time I uncover some new information about dream cultures, it just seems to be endless. There's just an endless amount of information, but it's not very well known. So in my book, I'm looking at evidence for dream cultures as far back as I can possibly find, really. And I would say that I think one of the earliest, when we talked about sort of Stone Age cultures, I think one of the earliest possibilities of a particular kind of dream culture is in a place like Çatalhöyük. So in ancient Anatolia, in southern Anatolia, a proto-city settlement, not really that much younger than Göbekli Tepe. The dwellings there, they were kind of built in this honeycomb formation, so all kind of higgledy-piggledy on top of each other. The dwellings were accessed through the roof, and every dwelling seems to have sleeping platforms purposefully built on top of intramural burials. So they're intentionally sleeping upon the buried or entombed bodies of, not necessarily their ancestors actually, because somehow they've managed to work out that the people buried in the houses weren't necessarily related to the people living in the houses. So I think for me, dreaming is very much connected with afterlife beliefs, and the more I kind of dig into the research, the more there seems to be this very close relationship in the ancient world between death and dreaming. And in the instance of Çatalhöyük, I think people were attempting to make contact with the deceased people in their dreams, and the idea perhaps was that the greater the proximity, the more likelihood you were to have these people in your dreams. And I think that, you know, one of the most moving aspects of dreaming for a lot of people, if anyone's ever had a dream where you have contact with a deceased loved one, it feels incredibly real. it can be really meaningful and moving for the dreamer. And I think for ancient people and for most open-minded people these days, gives them a sense of the fact that there's something beyond this ordinary waking life, and that when we die, we don't necessarily cease to exist in the way that materialist reductionist science would have us believe. And I read this really nice quote from I think an Israeli archaeologist who, when she was uncovering burials in a cave in Israel, said that we have to kind of bear in mind that ancient people didn't necessarily view biological death in the same way that we do. And I think that that's something worth thinking about, but it's hard for us to kind of understand, because in this modern world we see death as the end. Most people do. That's how it's presented to us in terms of science and medical treatment and things like this. But I've recently come back from the Sanctuary of Asklepios at Abodavros, and there you have this sacred precinct. When you're there, it really feels like it's a divine city, a self-contained divine city encircled by a sacred grove, and within this sacred precinct you are subject to divine influence, and this sacred grove acts as a kind of buffer zone between the world of mortals and the world of gods and goddesses. And there's this beautiful structure at the heart of this sanctuary. So this whole sanctuary is dedicated to Apollo, but chiefly it's considered to be the Sanctuary of Asklepios, who is the Greek god of dream healing, essentially. So he's like a divine healer. And this central building is called the Thymelium, and it is a tholos. It's a circular altar building, and the top structure is missing. They're trying to reconstruct part of it at the moment. But underneath the circular peristyle hall, there are three concentric rings that make up a kind of labyrinthine basement. And the idea now is that patients visiting this sanctuary would enter into Hades, and there was this idea that you had to go through this kind of pseudo-death, and your sick self would die in the underworld of Hades, in the dream world with Asklepios, and then your healthy self could be reborn. So there was a initiatory or a mystery type function in these sleep sanctuaries, where incubation was considered to be somehow a mirror or a parallel world to the world of the dead. And if you look into ancient dream interpretation in Egypt and the Near East, dreams always are seen to offer this portal into the other world, into the world of the dead and the world of the gods and goddesses. In Mesopotamia, people, when they were born, had personal gods allotted to them, and if you got ill, it was seen that your personal gods had just lost interest in you for some reason, or you'd annoyed them, so you'd have to beg your personal gods to be under their protection again. Interesting to me that in most ancient dream interpretation is preoccupied with predicting the future. But I've just been reading Peter Kingsley's book as well, and actually he makes a really good point in this book about our idea of prophecy and divination is slightly different these days to the way the ancient Greeks and other ancient cultures perceived prophecy and divination. It's not just about predicting the future, it's about seeing the truth. Like having your ears and eyes licked clean by the serpents of Asklepios is to see the world as it truly is, and that's a form of prophecy as well. So dreams offer this portal to the realm of the dead and to the gods, and the further we go back, the closer those gods and goddesses begin to resemble stars and planets. And the earliest goddesses associated with dreaming are goddesses like Gula, who's an astral goddess of Sumer, and she's the dog goddess that you mentioned. She's a healing goddess. And in her temples, physicians were trained in the arts of healing, so they would be trained in medicines, and they were familiar with this vast herbal pharmacopoeia. They practiced euthanasia apparently as well, but there was also this element whereby dreaming could serve a healing function as well, and in a dream you could be contacted by a divine being and you could have a spontaneous healing response as a result of having this divine intervention in the dream state. So dreams are for connecting with the dead. They're part of necromancy, for finding out the future from deceased people, and they're a form of ancestor worship. They provide you the opportunity to have contact with divine beings, and they can heal you. And it's been like of great interest to me how a dream might actually heal someone. Like in real life, how could a dream really heal someone? And the Asklepians functioned and were popular for about 2,000 years, these dream healing sanctuaries. And you can trace an evolution of the kind of medicine that they practiced, beginning as a sort of magico-religious medicine, and then turning into more of the kind of medicine that we're familiar with these days. But Asklepios, the dream healer god, is always considered to be the supreme physician. So this kind of divine, spontaneous intervention, and this, if you like, a kind of placebo effect working, is considered to be like the best, most superior type of medicine. And then also, I mean, Peter Kingsley talks about this in his book as well, this idea that you can receive wisdom from the dream state. You can receive information from the gods and goddesses that you can then transmit to a community. So he talks a lot about laws being transmitted in dreams, being given by the gods to human beings, and then they become lawgivers, kind of acting as a conduit for ideas of the gods. So you mentioned as well, like the old women of Anatolia. So the old women of Anatolia, this is a kind of a culture that provides, I think, some continuity from cultures like that which existed at Çatalhöyük into Hatti and Hittite times. So the old women of Anatolia, they were fantastic dream interpreters apparently, and the Hatti were a culture, the indigenous population of Turkey. The Hittites took over this region, and they were quite a military orientated patriarchal society, and apparently they wanted to do away with the Hattis in terms of they wanted to get rid of the old women and the old women's influence at court. But these old women, there was a network of old women apparently all over Turkey, and they just were the go-to people if you needed oracles, if you needed spells, and a lot of their spells were about preventing nightmares. There's this idea in Anatolia that if you had a lot of nightmares, it could shorten your life, and the symbols associated with women in Anatolia are the spindle and the mirror. And I think I'm fascinated in mirrors. It's one of my pet interests, is the history of mirrors, and how in particular this kind of cultural artifact can reveal perceptions of reality in the ancient world, because mirrors are a relatively new invention in terms of them being used every day in terms of cameras and films and whatnot. But some of the earliest mirrors ever discovered were found in Çatalhöyük, and they're about 9,000 years old, like polished obsidian surfaces. So these old women in Anatolia, they were spread out all across Anatolia, and they were considered incredibly influential and important. And even though the Hittite rulers tried to get rid of them, they couldn't do without their wisdom, apparently. They had to still call them in for decisions to be made about succession and military campaigns and all sorts of stuff. And so you see evidence of their spells being things like using mirrors to make men impotent, and shortening someone's life by shortening the amount of thread that they'll let out of a spindle, things like this. And then you also start to see that ancient Anatolians had a sun goddess as well, and you see the solar goddess as kind of being the beginning of these agrarian cults as well, of celebrating the goddess and calling the goddess back to the earth to increase abundance and fertility on earth as well. And so mirrors are important because they do relate to this idea. You know, you're mentioning ancient Egyptian dream interpretation, and in quite a lot of ancient Egyptian dream interpretation there's this idea of opposites. So if you dream something negative, like you're saying, dying, that means a long life. If you dream something that we would consider to be negative in waking reality, it can sometimes mean a good thing in Egyptian dream interpretation. But mostly in ancient Egyptian, ancient Near Eastern, perhaps those two more than any of the others, there's this idea that well, language is vitally important to how we interpret dreams in these countries, and these areas. So most dream interpretation is based upon homophones, wordplay and punning. And so this is why dream journaling is so important for dreaming, because quite often a meaning, an interpretation relies upon the looking at the word, and so unless you write these words down, you don't necessarily get the correct meaning of things. I started to teach myself hieroglyphs during lockdown, as you do, and one thing I did notice is because it's a, although it's it's a phonetic, they're phonetic symbols that have phonetic meanings, that you have uniliterals, biliterals, triliterals, determinatives and phonetic complements, that because they are pictorial, you can't help but make associations with them. So in order to remember Egyptian words, you kind of make visual associations based upon the components of those words. And so I'm sure that Egyptian people would have done this as well. And so it's a much more kind of sympathetic script for dreaming because of all these associations, because dreaming is so association based. So if you want to change your dreaming, learning hieroglyphs can be very useful for that. So talking about how material culture influences our perception of the world, about this condition, there's a psychiatric condition called the glass delusion, and one of the kings of France suffered from this, which I think is really interesting because it goes to show how material culture influences the way we see ourselves and the way we perceive reality. So King Charles, he was first of all called the beloved King Charles, and then he later became known as Mad King Charles. He suffered from the glass delusion, because it was when glass started to be used as a building material for rich people, and he started to think that he was made of glass and that he would shatter if anyone touched him, so he had to wear especially sort of padded outfits to stop anyone from tipping him over and shattering him. And then also in ancient Egypt as well, the word for mirror in ancient Egyptian is ankh, so it's the same as life, and mirrors were a symbol of rebirth and are often associated with the goddess Hathor, and they're often featured in postpartum scenes as well. I talked a little bit about how in ancient Mesopotamia the stars and the planets were the gods and goddesses. I think that's where we get these ancient alien ideas from, is the fact that ancient people in the Near East really believed the stars and planets were living beings, sentient, divine, conscious entities, and this kind of gets misinterpreted that means they're kind of alien in origin, but I think they just had this different awareness of how a celestial being could exist. So there's this lovely idea, there's an Assyriologist who's no longer with us, called Erica Rayner, who wrote a book called, I think it's called Astral Magic in Babylonia, and she has this term called astral irradiation, which involves putting a patient or a charm amulet underneath the stars to absorb the heavenly radiance of the gods and goddesses, and that this could be a form of healing. And then Sophus Helle, I don't know if you have this in stock actually, he's just written a new translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is amazing, and he's also just published the collected works of Enheduanna, the world's first named author, who's a priestess of Inanna in Ur, I think. So in Gilgamesh, there's quite a lot of descriptions of the construction of what's called a house of Zakiku, which is a temporary structure, which is kind of like a temporary sacred precinct that you purposefully dream in, is where you incubate dreams, and that this provides you with the necessary the rituals involved to make contact with the gods. And so in Gilgamesh it describes the constructions of these house of Zakiku when Gilgamesh wants to have a divine dream, and this is just a simple reed hut, and it's encircled by a circle of flour. And dreams are used a lot as narrative devices. We see, especially in Egypt, the dream stele between the paws of the Sphinx, for example. Because dreams were considered to be often messages of the gods, it was used as a sort of propaganda text quite often, to be like, this is definitely what's meant to happen because I had a dream that this god told me to do it, so it must be true. So, oh yeah, sorry, you're not looking at my screen, are you? Anyway, so the reed hut, you quite often see the reed hut in some of the thinks is a cylinder seal impression, a reed heart with the astral or celestial symbols above it of the gods and goddesses, and Gula often represented as a dog protecting the sleeper. So in some of the temples, and then also this may have happened in temples to goddesses like Astarte, Hecate and Ishtar as well, is that people would be licked by dogs as a form of medicine as well. The dogs were considered to be theriomorphic forms of divine beings. And Gula was associated with the Babylonian constellation of the she-goat, which is Lyra these days. So it's important to recognise how dreams are seen to occur in this underworld, because the great below in Mesopotamian thinking is this realm of generation, and it's where Shamash, where the sun is born, where the sun travels through when the sun sets, and it's the realm of prophecy, because this is where those things about to be born into the future are germinating. So if you want to know the future, you need to be in the underworld, because that's where the beginnings of these ideas are seeding. So Nanshi is another Mesopotamian goddess who was a dream oracle and seen as a divine interpreter. And apparently, I don't know how much evidence there is for this, but I have read that her priests had to go through a kind of quasi-death ritual, that they had to die and enter the underworld, the great below, to become priests of Nanshi. And she's associated with the Persian Gulf, with fish and water birds, and she's also associated with abundance, and she's said to like swell beer pots and the coffers, and she's a protectress of the poor, needy orphans as well. So in terms of ancient Egypt, you have Imhotep associated, syncretized with Asklepios during the Greco-Roman period, and Imhotep was a real man who was in the court of Djoser, of the stepped pyramid, and he's alleged to be the architect of the stepped pyramid of Djoser as well. But whether or not that's true, I'm not sure, because there's only one source for that information. And he was deified about 3,000 years after his death as well, so it's quite hard to know what the real man was like and how he becomes deified later on, and he becomes associated with the dream healer god Asklepios. But there's some beautiful accounts of divine dreams from a man called Hor, who was a priest of Thoth or Juti, and he was dreaming in the necropoli at Saqqara, in the Ibis galleries and in the Serapeum, and having these prophetic divine dreams and offering healing advice to people that came to visit him as well. And in the Asclepian sleep temples, which are really the most kind of developed and elaborate sacred sleep sanctuaries in the ancient world. So Epidavros, for example, is, as I say, like a divine self-contained city where you have temple structures to a variety of different gods. There's shops, there are 4 bathhouses in the Sanctuary of Asklepios at Epidavros. There's a theatre, gymnasium, stadium, and just everything that you could possibly want in this sacred precinct. So at the Asklepia they practiced this form of sacred sleep, enkoimesis, which was this idea that sleep and death are brothers somehow. Hypnos and Thanatos are brothers, and by undergoing this kind of pseudo death, having this sacred sleep, the sick self can die and the healthy self can be reborn. And then, I mean, Peter Kingsley talks about this in his book, this idea of incubation, ancient ideas of incubation, because Asklepios took over in some ways from Apollo. Apollo was always the incubation god before Asklepios, and Asklepios is Apollo's son. There was this idea of healing being related to stillness and quietness, and that people would sleep in caves like animals retreating to their lair when they're injured, and just be still perhaps for a matter of days, and they would, over the course of these days, enter altered states and be visited by the gods associated with the underworld quite often, because this would take place in caves and chthonic areas. So I don't know if you can see this. This is a relief from Epidavros, and this shows a patient undergoing the sacred sleep process, enkoimesis, and she's sleeping on a kline, which is where we get the word clinic from, and she is being touched by the god Asklepios, and his daughter Aegea is standing behind him. And so the ideal scenario when you visited one of these sleep sanctuaries is that you would have a dream in which Asklepios the god or one of his family visits you and heals you directly. So there are accounts of things like Asklepios came and cut off my head, tipped out all the bees, and then sewed my head back on, and I woke up and didn't have a headache ever again, kind of thing. So there are these like supernatural, like spectacular healing events that occur, and it's made me think about how, especially in the lucid state, when you're really lucid, really conscious, and you have an incredible experience in a dream, there is a kind of bodily response. And I always give the example actually that you can have an orgasm in an erotic dream, and if your body can biophysically respond to visual content in a dream and feeling content, emotional content in a dream like that, then perhaps it can also provoke that kind of instantaneous placebo faith healing types of response as well. But there are certain kind of caveats in entering these sanctuaries anyway, because they wouldn't let anyone who was too close to dying come in, because I think they knew they didn't want to be polluted by death. And so no one on the verge of giving birth was allowed in, and no one on the verge of dying was allowed in. There were these like separate hostels on the outskirts of the sanctuary where they would go. So Asklepios, I sometimes describe him as a kind of like Wim Hof type figure, because he was really into cold water bathing, but just snakes were involved as well. And he was a kind healer figure, and he was a massive threat to Jesus. In fact, I think that the early iconography of Jesus is based upon Asklepios, because he's this bearded healer, kindly god who basically provides miracles for people. And I think, one thing I would say as well, Mervat mentioned this when she was talking about Hermopolis, my friend, my Egyptian friend who's built a hermetic retreat in the middle of Egypt, is there was this great appreciation that I think we need to return to, that harmony and beauty can actually heal people. And there was this understanding in the ancient world that if the outside is beautiful, if they're existing in these incredible sanctuaries. These sanctuaries were always in beautiful settings. We've got lovely views of the mountains and the sea, and you're surrounded by nature, fresh water, beautiful architecture. That in itself is a really powerful healing mechanism. And the technique, the idea of forest bathing that we have now comes from Japanese research in the 1980s, where they tried to reintroduce nature back into healing, and it's been shown that it helps people heal faster if they're in beautiful surroundings, they're surrounded by nature. So I think that this is something that I'm keen to reintroduce to the world, this idea that sleeping and dreaming can be potent forms of medicine even now. And everyone knows if you wake up from a terrible dream, you feel awful. If you wake up from an amazing, incredible dream, you feel fantastic. And so I want to do as much as possible to try and to encourage people to have fantastic dreams, and to bring dreaming back into holistic healing, essentially, because I think it has a lot of power. I think that's probably about it, isn't it?
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You don't remember.
What if you don't dream? Well, I think one of the reasons why people don't think they remember their dreams is about visualization and visual memory. So one thing to do would be to try to increase visual abilities, so visually imagining things. Having afternoon naps can be really useful, because you tend to have more extended periods of REM and you tend to sleep more shallowly, so that can be a good way of remembering it. I think, when you wake up from a dream, if you don't have the ability to vividly, visually conjure it back up, it can be difficult to remember. So that's why it's so important to write things down. But it's also one of the defining features of lucid dreaming, is that you remember it perfectly. So because different parts of the brain are active during lucid dreaming, the frontal cortex is active, you're able to self-reflect and practice critical thinking. You do just remember lucid dreams. So lucid dreams are all about memory as well. That's why I'm so fascinated by the goddess Mnemosyne, because she's the goddess of remembrance, and she is the goddess that's invoked as part of the final rituals before you enter the Abaton. And I think it's not just because you want to remember your dream, it's about you want to remember that you're in the dream whilst you're there. So yeah, practicing anything to do with memory and any kind of nootropics, any kind of supplements that improve memory, ginkgo biloba, lion's mane, things like that can be really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, in your earlier thing about sleep healing, you say that was a form of like astral healing? And the second point, if I may, what is the difference between sleep and being in a trance state?
Between sleep
I
and...
could see you doing in a dreaming state,
Yeah.
a trance state, is it? Or is there?
There doesn't seem to be much differentiation in the ancient Greek idea of things, at least. There's not... there are descriptions of what sound more like altered trance type states in some of the healing experiences that happened in the Asklepian, but similarly they can also happen in the dream state as well. So I think it's however these visions manifest, however this experience of contacting the divine happens, but the idea is that you lie down and you wait for it. Incubate is really just about lying down and waiting for it. So these things can come in dreams, they can come in visions. There isn't a hierarchy in some ways of what's better or what's the way to get it. It's just when it, there is a categorization in ancient dreaming quite often of there are divine dreams and then there are dreams, ordinary dreams. And divine dreams, they don't need any interpretation. They're just clear contact with a divine being.
And there wasn't any kind of like burning incense or things?
Definitely there would have been, but there may have been opium fumigation, something like that in the Avatons, in the Asklepians. I think that's quite likely because a lot of the traditions seem to, especially in relation to the mysteries of Alephsis, for example, a lot of that seems to have come from Crete, where there was a lot of worship of the poppy goddess and there was fumigation of opium there. Yeah.
Can I ask if there's a connection with the Delphi Oracle? Because I think there was like gases being emitted.
Yeah.
And stuff. Oh, okay.
Well, the Delphi is associated with Apollo, so in his role as someone involved in the prophetic arts, then yes. But in terms of like the gases escaping, I mean, that's more like earth gases, isn't it? And there is this idea that prophecy can heal, though, because by revealing the truth, you can make someone healthier, because a lot of what makes people ill is them not understanding or knowing their own reality. Yeah. So Apollo is a healer god, and so his relationship with Delphi is definitely well established.
But may I develop the conversation about psychedelics and things like ayahuasca and ibogaine? Not that I'm proposing that everyone's going to take them up, but I understood that if people do, it accelerates the dream process or a connection with divine consciousness in some way. So what's the difference between that and lucid dreaming, where you're crafting and creating something that's natural and organic from within yourself, as opposed to using an agent to be able to do it?
I have never taken psychedelics, but talking to people that have taken psychedelics, there seems to be a strong element of waking lucid dream in them. And I wouldn't like to say, because I haven't taken them, but to me there seems to be a strong relationship between essentially waking dreams and verging on waking lucid dreams. And if that's the case, then this is why set and setting can be so important, because if you're in a not very nice setting, and I know people that have undergone clinical trials and their experiences of it seem certainly coloured by the environment they're in the same way that our dreams are coloured by the impressions that we have in our life and in even in our immediate sleeping environment, in fact. So the sounds and stuff that are happening in our sleeping environment, in the same way that when you undergo a clinical trial and you're sitting in a MRI scanner, the clinking, clunking sounds often turn into mechanical elves and stuff like this. So, yeah. So you had a question as well.
Thing is, what would you recommend to someone who has like constant dreams, like one after the other, in terms of dream journaling? And I keep wondering, how am I going to write all of them down as much as I can remember.
So I've been lucid dreaming since I was a kid, and my lucid dreams I used as mostly wish fulfillment as a kid. And I'd fly, I'd like kiss boys that I fancied in my class, have really nice Christmas presents, stuff like that. And then I went through a period of sleep deprivation when I had my daughter in 2008. Feel like I didn't sleep for about 2 years, and I was bereft. I didn't feel like me at all, because I was cut off from access to this entire creative, amazing realm that I've created over my lifetime. So when I got it back, I was just so grateful, and the wish fulfillment seemed to tail off, and I was more about just appreciating it and asking the dream. So if you already have a lot of lucid dreams, what I would do is more sort of dream incubation, dream intention setting to do particular things. I mean, one thing I found as well is I had like a recurring dream or a recurring dream theme that I loved. And like people say, like, recurring dreams, you don't want to have them anymore. But my one was like really great. It was where I was like questing for either the water of memory, the water of life, or the fountain of eternal youth. It was always like questing for this sacred spring. And it's the most boring reason, I realised, but it was like 10 years after I've been having this dream for so long. I went to get my hair cut in Hastings, and my hairdresser came from the same part of Croydon that I was born in. And we were comparing notes on what we did as kids, and he went, "Oh, did you go to Bedington Park and drink from that magic spring?" And I just had this sudden like, oh my God, my entire life has been based upon this one silly urban legend that we had in Croydon about this magic spring. And what often happens when you figure out the reason for a recurring dream is it just stops. So this dream just stopped. And I loved that dream, so I had to make a conscious effort to be like, oh, I'll just go back to it anyway, even though I know it's from Croydon. I'll carry on having it because it was so nice. So yeah.
The second question was, you talked a lot about cultures which are, mainly settled in Europe, for example, or this side of the world. And have you checked with any Asian cultures or that background, and also the research pool that goes into like writing this book?
Yeah. I have been really interested in researching the Western esoteric tradition, because I think it's something that I feel is my sort of heritage and my ancestry, and I feel like a strong calling to Greece in particular. I feel at home as soon as I'm in Greece. But one thing that I think is that this all goes back to a really ancient culture that is probably in Turkey, and it's about relating our experience on earth with the heavens, which is the essence of all ancient religions when you get down to it, is the fact that we used to recognize that we are one with the stars, and because of light pollution, accidentally, I think we've just forgotten that we are cosmic beings.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I actually got a ticket for you at Atlantis, but I thought it was in the evening, so I missed it.
Oh,
Thank you for doing this.
you're welcome.
I was wondering, some of us are very fortunate because we dream in colour, and some people have like Cecil B. DeMille type dreams. What advice can you give perhaps for people that can only dream in black and white? I don't know if there's a bit of frustration that if people can't dream in
It's
colour.
fascinating to me that some people dream in black and white. I find it very curious. A bit like how I was saying to you about practicing visual imagination. And try watching Holy Mountain before you go to bed, because that's one of the most spectacular, technicolor, insane, archetypal graphic imagery films ever. And maybe, the reason why I went to see Hilma af Klint, even though I only had 45 minutes to do it, was the person I was with previously said to me, oh, I had the most amazing colourful dreams after looking at the big canvases. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go and look at them. And I had a similar thing when I went to see, Paul Lafferly, the outsider artist Paul Lafferly. He's got these beautiful paintings, and incredibly detailed, weird, futuristic mandalas with lots of colours. And they are meant to activate something in your consciousness when you look at them.
My friend is a sacred geometer. She produces work like this. This is Milena.
Oh,
amazing.
Well, it's not quite sacred geometry. It's something else, but they're like conceived to alter your consciousness, and some of them you're supposed to stand in certain positions and hold your hands up to them and things like this. I think there's one called the Thanaton where you're supposed to put your hands on it. And so I love the idea of that psychomagic, that art can work its way. And I think this is why ancient cultures probably had a much more meaningful relationship with their dreams, because mythic culture was just writ large in everything and anything they ever did. There's like nothing that isn't purposeful and meaningful really in ancient cultures. There's no sort of mass-produced tat like we get these days that is kind of meaningless. I go to the British Museum a lot, and there's an amazing bowl there, which is the note for it is it's a libation bowl dedicated to the goddess Hathor, or at least decorated with the goddess Hathor's face. But if you look at it, and I run like a Egyptology lecture series called Explorers Egyptology, and we had one whole show on mirrors, and because Hathor is associated with mirrors, this libation bowl, if you look at it, has got a small circle in the middle of it. So it basically makes up a sun glyph, which is the face of a mirror. So filled with water, that would act as a mirror and make that object into a mirror. And that whole object is then acting as a glyph, as a symbol. So I think, and the extra amount of effort that's required to make that small circle in the middle, to turn it into a glyph for the sun, the Ra glyph, it's not accidental. It's very meaningful that extra circle is in there. So, I love visiting the British Museum and trying to read the art and the symbols, because all of these things are communicated. And I think our culture these days is so confused and chaotic and disorientating that these myths are still trying to communicate with us, but we quite often miss the meaning because we aren't educated, generally speaking, as we grow up on mythology, and we're not.
Can you cite the artist again?
Paul Laffoley.
Paul
Laffoley.
L-A-F-F-E-R-L-E-Y.
Laffoley.
Okay.
Oh, well, fascinating story.